This is part 3 in a series of videos on getting started with CPN tools. In part 2 we saw the CPN tools user interface, and in this video we'll see how to do basic simulation inside of CPN tools. So let's get started. We start by loading in a model. We use the marking menu. This is the simple protocol. This is basically a non-hierarchical version of the protocol we saw last time. So when we have loaded in the model, we see that we get a whole bunch of green annotations. So when we look at the model, we get for all of the places, or most of the places, we get a green rectangle and a green circle. The green rectangle indicates the number of tokens, in this case 1, and the color of the token, that is the value of the token. So this has one token with value 1, modeling, one token with value 2, D and M, one token with the pair 3, analysis, B, and so on. In the circle we see the number of tokens, ignoring the value of the token, so we can see the sent place here has 8 tokens in total. We can also count that this is indeed correct. If you don't care about the actual value of the token, we can simply click on the circle, and then the green rectangle disappears, and we now only see a circle with the number of tokens. And we can click again to get back the actual values of the tokens. We also see we have a number of transitions, and the send package transition is different in that it has a green glow around it. The green glow means that the transition is enabled and thus can be executed. We see that none of the other transitions have a green glow around it. So this transition is green and basically just begging to be executed. So let's go to the toolbox and find the simulation tools. Drag them out onto the workspace. We can see we use a VCR DVD player metaphor for the simulation tool. So we can rewind, we can stop, we can go forward in small steps, we can play the simulation as a movie, or we can simply fast forward through to the simulation. We will not be using this tool. So let's just start a simulation. We select this tool, the play tool, which will give us an interactive simulation of the model. So we select the play tool by clicking on the tool sub, and we apply it to the background. And now we see tokens moving around in the model. And all of this happens completely without interference, and I can see how the model works, and I can see we have received part of the message over here, and some packages are being transmitted across the network. So maybe this is too slow for me and I don't want to look at this, so I basically just stop the simulation, and now no tokens are moving around anymore. Out here in the index we see that we have a step counter which counts the number of steps we have executed, and it is in this case 26 steps. We also have an entry for the current model time, which is this point 0, because we're not using a time model. If the interactive simulation where we see the feedback is too slow, we can also execute instead just fast forward through the execution and execute a whole bunch of steps at once. And when I apply this tool, the tokens move around, and the model state changes, and my step counter increases by 50. And I can apply the tool more than once to execute the simulation. Now we see that no more transitions are enabled, and if I move my mouse cursor down here, I can see that the reason the simulation has stopped is because there are no more enabled transitions. When I have reached such a dead state, I can simply select the rewind tool and go back to the initial state, and we can then simulate from scratch. We also see the step count goes back to 0. The interactive simulation and fast forward tool are useful for getting a broad overview of the execution of a model. Sometimes I may need more control though. For instance, I might want to execute just a single transition and then examine the resulting marking. I may also want to execute a particular transition to see how that affects the execution of the system, for instance to drive the system into a failure state. For this I can use the single step tool, and I can apply it to the background to execute a random transition, and I have all the time in the world to inspect the resulting marking. I can also apply the tool to a particular transition to execute that transition, and for instance produce as many packages as I want here on the place A. Sometimes a transition is non-deterministic, that is, it can execute in more than one binding. This means that if I just execute the transitions, sometimes I may actually successfully transmit the package, leading to another package over here, and sometimes I may accidentally drop the package, just consuming the package from the A place. So you can see if I execute here, I just decreased the counter on the A place, but didn't decrease the one on the B place. And executing again, I decreased the counter over here and produced a new package over here. When I use the single step tool, this choice is made automatically for me. I can also do this choice manually by selecting the bind manual execution tool and apply it to the transition. This gives me a brief index which contains all the available variables around this transition. I can see that N has to be bound to 3, P has to be bound to analysis speed, S has to be bound to 8, but I can choose the value for R. I can see that by the question mark and the blue rectangle. I click the blue rectangle, I can see all the possible values for R. So I can try and select a high value for R and apply the tool again. And this executes the transition. We can see that high values of R leads to just consuming a value from A and not producing one on B. So we can try apply the tool again and select a low value for R, and now we have produced a new token over on B. So we can see that if R is a high value, then we are dropping the packages, and if it's a low value, we are actually producing, we are successfully transmitting packages. So I can use the tools directly from the tool palette, but I can also use some shortcuts. For instance, I can use the marking menu to automatically fire a transition. So simply right click on a transition and select to fire that transition. And I can do that as many times as I want. This has the same effect as using the single step tool. If I want to, I can also use the bind manually tool without going to the tool palette by simply left clicking on this small green rectangle on enable transitions, which gives me the binding index, and I can select my desired binding and simply left click on the binding index when the marking is complete to execute the binding. It turns yellow, and you can see we have executed the transition in this binding, producing a new token over here. So we can see that the simulation tools, such as single step, play and fast forward, sort of act like the execution commands we have available in standard debugger. For instance, assume we want to investigate well how this protocol handles that the next send counter decreases. The counter is currently 3, but what happens if for some reason the counter suddenly became 2? Well, let's take a look. I simply click on the marking, and now we get a grayed out background, so we can now change the marking. So we simply set the value of the marking of the place to 1, 2 instead. And the model is immediately ready for simulation, and we can try and send some packages. And we see that the model correctly sends package number 2. We might also be interested in investigating how can we actually come by decreasing the value of the next send counter. Well, what if we receive an acknowledgement for package number 1 over here? Well, let's try and do that. So we change the marking of this place. Oh, but it doesn't contain any tokens, so there's nothing for me to click on. Well, we just right click to get the marking menu and select to show marking. And now we see we have no tokens and an empty multiset. Let's try and change that to 1, 1. Now receive act becomes enabled. I can execute it, and we see we have decreased the next send counter. Now the next question is it actually possible to get into a state where we have one value of the counter here and we have an acknowledgement with a lower value here? That's a fun exercise. I'll leave up to you to decide. We can do that using the tools for showing marking, changing the marking, using single step simulation and manual binding of transitions to actually find out whether that's possible. And you can also figure out using simulation how the protocol handles if this happens. So I thank you for your attention and see you in part 4, where we'll start editing the CPN model.